You wake us up, that's what it is. But now we're Brendan.
When did you join, Peter?
August 18th.
August 18th.
That's about
Nice to have a new man in the group.
Oh, there's Brendan trying to find me.
All right. How's it going, y'all?
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. How y'all doing?
Good. You're still at work, I see.
I am. Yes, my kids are having some friends over at my house, and so the house is loud, I think, and there are kids in my study. So I just, I live across the street from the school, so I just walk over to my office.
Oh, nice, nice.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, I'm still trying to get you on the projected screen, so bear with me. I'm having more trouble than usual. I don't know why. Come on.
There you go.
Something. Not enough. HDMI1. Let's move that back. Press the question.
They seem to score runs when he pitches for some reason.
One time we got 8 points in that.
We may end up watching him on my computer.
Well, nobody's.
Tomorrow night, I mean.
Yeah, he's pitching tomorrow night, then Sale. I'm not sure who Thursday.
Where is Thursday? Here?
The Braves might not be sure either.
Yeah.
Apparently there's a couple of disturbance coming up, and it said we should.
Oh, that's a game I don't even recognize.
They're just beginning to get some people back.
I get to do. Sounds like we're good. Oh, yeah, so I love the table.
They gotta beat the Mets 3 in a row.
Well, there's another player, the Mets are actually tied with the Diamondbacks.
Oh, no.
So if the Diamondbacks lose, say we win 2 out of 3, Diamondbacks lose 1 out of 2 out of 1. Lose 2 out of 3. Who are they playing?
Unfortunately, I think the Padres have been playing pretty well lately.
Yeah. I don't think we'll catch the Padres.
No. Well, it's good for the economy.
Yeah.
All I can say is Monday Night Football are the Bengals. I'm from Ohio.
Well, gentlemen, we may have to watch it on my computer tonight. It's not you, Brennan, it's me. I can't figure out what I've done different. I didn't get all the wires from Will Meyer that I usually get. I thought I found one that would do the trick, but now I can't.
Gotcha. Yeah.
I won't keep you long. I'm just trying to. All right, I think that's what we're just gonna have to do. Let's see.
Sounds like we can hear us.
We're going to hear him. We're going to be able to see him, but we won't see his big, beautiful mug up there. We're going to see his mug on my computer. Can everybody do that okay?
That's fine.
Sorry. I don't know if it's this cord or what. I did something wrong or I didn't get the
Is
right
that gonna get
equipment.
too hot sitting up?
Turn that off.
Can y'all hear?
Yes.
All right. All right. How y'all been?
Doing good.
Excellent. So I was going to ask at the very beginning if anyone had any questions or anything that came up last time when we looked at really at Daniel 1. Because today what I want to look at, if we have time, is Daniel 3 and 6, which is the fiery furnace and the lion's den. Probably the two most famous stories that we can get in the Daniel sequence here. But was there anything about that first week that anyone had any questions about or thought about? We're all good, huh? All right, so great. So Daniel's in Babylon, right? He's in exile. He's learned the literature and language of the Chaldeans, so he's become like an expert, like exorcist and diviner for the Babylonians. He probably doesn't believe in that stuff, but he's been put in these positions where the king thinks that he's super smart, and then elevated him, of course, at the end of chapter 1 to like a really important position of honor. And if you can just imagine for a moment what an ancient Babylonian person might have thought when a Jew ended up getting elevated above them and now was their boss. So he becomes this kind of second in command of the entire kingdom, right? There's the king and then there's Daniel, this Jewish guy who got taken from Jerusalem. I'm guessing that the local Babylonians did not think very highly of this, especially when they were passed over for promotion and now they had to take orders from some guy, the foreigner that they didn't know. So there's a whole like genre of story from the ancient world that's about foreigners trying to survive in the court of a king. And basically the big question that all these stories have, one of them is called the Ahikar story, a famous story from ancient Egypt. There's a bunch of these stories from Babylon, but basically they're stories written by ethnic minorities within these huge empires. They get promoted because they're really smart and really talented, but also because they get promoted, the local people hate them. And so the big question that a lot of these different texts basically think about and ask questions about in kind of narrative form. They think through it in the forms of stories, trying to give examples of how can you survive, right? And the big question is, how do you survive? How do you not die and be a foreigner working for a king at a high level? So Daniel takes these stories and is telling a story in the vein of these legends and stories that have been around previously. The Ahikar story. It's kind of it's a fictitious story about this guy named Ahikar, who's an Aramean guy, a Syrian guy who gets taken to Egypt and then ends up becoming like a really important counselor to Pharaoh. And the Egyptians want to kill him because he's taken their job. And so it's basically him trying to like acquit himself of these different bad positions he's put in. So the Daniel story is a lot like that in several respects. Chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 5 are these like what they call contest narratives, where there's really a conflict between Daniel or Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the local Babylonians who they've surpassed. The Daniel stories add another little twist to it. It's not just how do you survive, but they keep coming back to the question of how do you remain loyal to your God. So Ahikar doesn't really care about his gods. The guy who went from Syria to Egypt and became an important counselor, he just was like he was a different kind of person because he was ethnically Syrian, and they tried to hurt him for that. But Daniel's got another added layer of complication, which is how do you remain loyal when your worship is weird? So that is to say, Daniel and his friends had these rules about food in chapter 1, but here in chapter 3, we'll see about actual like physical worship, like liturgical worship, that are unusual for the day and age and that make them a big target. So that's the same thing comes up in the lion's den story as well. Like their religion becomes a weakness. And so there's a temptation, of course, to abandon the religion. Just get rid of your religion. And if you were an ancient Jew who had just seen your city get destroyed and the temple get destroyed, and your king, the Davidic king, who was supposed to be like, the one that God had put on the throne and was supposed to be loyal to forever, you just saw the king get executed in public and all of his kids got killed. So they just extinguished the Davidic line, right? So you watch that go away, you watch the temple go away. I mean, you might be tempted to say, well, I might just worship the Babylonian gods then because they must be more powerful. Or maybe Yahweh like left us and abandoned us, and would Yahweh ever come back to us? The book of Lamentations literally asks that question. It ends by saying, God, even if we wanted to be with you again, would you want to be with us again? We don't know. So in the midst of all that, Daniel is this story of being loyal to Yahweh, the God of Israel, like in the midst of this displacement and destruction and in the midst of all this turmoil. So what looks to be this huge weakness for Daniel ends up being his greatest strength, but in ways that only he really can tell and notice. So starting with that, like Daniel 3, I'll take us through a little bit of Daniel 3 here. So it starts by King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, made a golden statue whose height was 60 cubits and whose width was 6 cubits. And he set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So a cubit was about the size, the distance from your elbow to basically like your forearm. But there was another kind of cubit that went all the way to your hand. So there's two different kinds of ancient cubits, one longer than the other. How big this is, we don't exactly know, but we do know that it wouldn't have stood up. So 60 cubits tall is, I mean, if you think of that as being like 120 feet tall, and then 6 cubits wide, so 12 feet wide. So a statue that's 12 feet wide and 120 feet tall, made of metal, that thing's falling over. There's no way you're going to keep that thing up. It's too narrow. So physically, this thing is kind of like almost a joke. It's impressive, but improbable or impossible. And I think it's supposed to be funny when people hear like this ridiculous statue that he put up. Now, was it a statue of him or was it a statue of his God? We don't know. It doesn't really say what it is. It kind of doesn't matter. It's like whatever could be an idolatrous thing. This could be anything really. It kind of stands in as a symbol for anything people might worship. So then King Nebuchadnezzar sent for the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to assemble and come to the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. This list is supposed to be funny to people, not because it has anything ridiculous in it, but just because they keep repeating it in the story. And you'll hear all these lists. So the satraps, which is basically like the highest level of administration below the king. And they ran like the states basically. And then the prefects and the governors and the counselors and the treasurers, the justices, the local magistrates. So it's kind of going down the hierarchy of all the people that work for the king. So every single person from the local level up to the national level has to assemble at this one place and worship this one statue. So he calls for everyone to do this. And then verse 3, so the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces assembled for the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So he says it and it happens, but it has to be everybody. This is, well, I'll get to that in a second. So then they're standing before the statue and the herald, Nebuchadnezzar's public speaker, says, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages." So all peoples, all nations, all languages. It's a multicultural empire that the Babylonians have assembled here. That when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the drum, and the entire musical ensemble, you were to fall down and worship the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So this list, and it's supposed to sound like the propaganda from the ancient world. So starting with the Babylonians, the Persians next did this, but a lot of these ancient kings, they had intentional propaganda to try to get people to cooperate with their empires. So previous empires like the Assyrians and the Egyptians, they just told you they were going to kill you, and so you better get with the program and pay your taxes on time. Which is effective in some ways. It can be really scary, but that also means you need a big army that's always ready to go and kill people who don't pay their taxes, because that's the threat. And it happened. So this Pharaoh has to have this giant army that roves around the kind of kingdoms that are near him and just kind of hitting people up for money. It's like a mafia operation, sort of. And so the Assyrians had to do this too. They're the ones who destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel just for not paying their taxes. And people took risks sometimes. They're like, yeah, we're not going to pay our taxes because they've only got one big army, so it'll take a while for them to get over here. So the northern kingdom of Israel didn't pay their taxes, and the king of Assyria went right away. They kind of took him by surprise and took his one big army over there and just killed him. So that was the way that they did. But it's costly to the empire to do that. The Assyrians need to spend a lot of money a lot of time, and then you destroy the place. And so it's not really economically productive after that. It's just it's not a great for business, right? If the mafia burns down all of the businesses who don't participate in the protection racket, there's no business, right? So the Babylonians and then later the Persians get real, like they get a new idea, right? They sort of think this through, and they say, we don't, it takes a lot of money to force people to pay you taxes. And it sort of hurts the business to destroy the kingdoms this way. So what if we could like get people to like cooperate with us? Like just they want to? And the Babylonians started this, but really it was the Persians who got really good at this. I think chapter 3 was written during the Persian period. I think it was written after the time of Babylon by about 30 years. Babylon was a short-lived empire, actually. It was only like one generation, really, 2 generations of kings. It's like a 40-year empire where they were really in charge. And then the Persians came and just destroyed them. So I think this was written looking back slightly, and it's kind of affected by that. What the Persians did, they had a brilliant idea. Their idea was that they said that their god, Ahura Mazda, had told their king, King Cyrus, to enjoy, like to really love the peoples of the world for who they were. King Cyrus, when he conquered Babylon, he sent all the peoples home. He sent the Jews home to Jerusalem and gave them money to rebuild the temple. That's like why the Second Temple period begins. And then Ezra and Nehemiah, they rebuild the walls. That's all with the Persian king. But the Persian king also would gather the peoples of the world to their capitals, Persepolis being one of them in modern day Iran. And they would kind of have a procession where all the peoples of the world would carry their gifts and they would give them to the Persian king in public. And the Persian king would say, isn't it wonderful? Like, it's so great for us to all be an empire together. So there's all this public rhetoric about how wonderful it is that all the nations of the world gathered together in the Persian Empire to celebrate being an empire, about how fun it is to be an empire together, right? And how great, how much you get from it. You get so much from being in part of the Persian Empire. You get great like oversight and business administration help, and you get great public infrastructure. The Persians are going to build nice roads for you. So there's this like propaganda trying to lure you into being part of the empire. And what part of it was that they were trying to tell you that the whole rest of the world was on the same page. So why don't you just join in? It's going to be great. It's going to make everyone richer. It's going to, a rising tide lifts all boats was their idea. So these lists, I think, are meant to help us to hear in some ways these ancient Babylonian, but also later Persian stories, or kind of propagandistic stories that were about how the whole world got together and from the great graciousness of the great God and the great king of the empire, that everyone would benefit. So everyone's gathered together and they hear this wonderful music that's like this multicultural ensemble of music from all the nations of the world. And the instruments are like actually do come from different parts of the world. Anyway, so then verse 6, whoever does not fall down and worship, the herald says, shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. So you can celebrate with the whole empire, or you can get burned up to nothing. So there is an intense threat here. People have pointed out that blazing fire, like throwing people into fire, is not a punishment in the ancient world. We don't have any like instance of people doing this. This seems to be kind of an over-the-top kind of odd punishment, but it makes a little bit of sense because if you don't follow the story, if you don't get with the king's program that it's wonderful to be part of the empire, then you could start sowing seeds of discontent. So the king's going to just make you vanish. So there's nothing left of you except for some ashes. There's no sign that you were ever here if you don't get with the program and really enjoy yourself at the king's party. So, well, anyway, that's one of the things they can do. So, verse 7. Therefore, as soon as all the peoples of that were gathered there from all around the world heard the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the drum, and the entire musical ensemble, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So everyone's worshiping. But here's the but. Verse 8, it was at this time that certain Chaldeans, so some high-ranking guys who worked with Daniel and Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they came forward and they denounced the Jews. This part's written in Aramaic. This whole section of Daniel's written in the Aramaic language. And the Aramaic phrase here is they ate them into pieces, or they bit them into pieces. It was like an ancient idiom for talking behind people's backs. Like you're gonna chew them out or something like that. You're gonna chew them up and spit them out behind their backs. So they came and they said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. Now you, O king, made a decree, like a rule, a law, that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble You should all fall down and worship the golden statue. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. Well, you made the law, king. But here's the rub. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon. These really high-ranking guys, our new bosses that happen to not be like us. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They weren't even there. They pay no heed to you, O king. They do not serve your gods, and they do not worship the golden statue you have set up. So a lot of people have pointed out that this, like, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego don't like this rule, but they don't like protest it. They don't start a revolution. What they do is they just don't show up to work that day. So notice that this is advice in a way for, like, you don't need to get killed for things that aren't going to matter in the way. But notice to them, they're also not going to show up and worship. So they're not going to worship Nebuchadnezzar or his statue or his god, but they're also just going to try to, like, slyly absent themselves from difficult conversations where they have to tell the king, actually, we'll never worship you. We'll never worship your statue. So the kind of their competition, the Babylonian competition who want their jobs, are trying to use their weakness, and they really do see this as a weakness. The Babylonians worshipped all the gods. They didn't care. They would worship Yahweh too. I mean, like, that's a pantheon. Every god gets worshiped. Great. We'll worship our Babylonian gods the most, but well, fine. Everyone gets, it's more, the more the merrier in terms of ancient religion, except for the Jews. They're the one people we know of who just won't worship other gods. People called them atheists. Babylonians thought that Jews were atheists because they didn't believe in the gods. Later, Christians get called by atheists in the Roman Empire because they don't believe in the gods, right? You don't believe in Jupiter, right? Crazy. So these atheists, according to the Chaldeans, right? They just won't worship. They got a problem right there. So their devotion to Yahweh, right? The covenant tells them they can only worship one God, and that's Yahweh. You can't worship anything else. So they're stuck, and the Chaldeans are using what they know of their religion as a weak point to try to kill them. So then Nebuchadnezzar, verse 13, in a furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought in. He was real mad because this is, even though they didn't do it publicly, really, but still, it's not obeying him. And it's, if people find out that you don't really have to show up on the day that all the nations of the world are supposed to get together and worship the king, that's going to lead to some probably larger and more powerful dissent. So he can't risk that. Verse 14, Nebuchadnezzar says, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods, and that you do not worship the golden statue that I have set up? Now, if you are ready when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, if you're ready to fall down and worship that statue that I made, well and good, great. Then you're off scot-free. Maybe you're just sick at work that day, whatever, but I'm going to just redo the whole worship thing, and we'll see what you do, right? But if you don't worship, then you shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands?" And this is the real theological problem for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, for Daniel, right? Is that the world is set up in such a way at the moment for them where the Babylonian king has ultimate power. And the question the Jews might have had is, why, if Yahweh is the one who's in charge of the universe, if our God really is in charge, then why is it that the Babylonian king has my life in his hands? And if the Babylonian king has my life in his hands, and God has said that I have to avoid worship of the Babylonian king and his gods, what kind of choice is that? And is God powerful enough to help me? So who is the God that would deliver you out of my hands? And you might be thinking, is your pathetic little Yahweh God that I just demolished that city and I just knocked that temple to the ground? Yahweh doesn't even have a house now. I mean, what kind of power does Yahweh have? So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego respond. And what's interesting is you might imagine that they would have some like robust, long theological defense or some persuasive speech that's going to make the king, change his mind. I think I never saw it, but I heard about this movie where like there's a philosophy professor who's like an atheist and tries to make all the kids in his college class atheists, and you don't get credit if you don't agree that there's no God. And then like there's one kid who persuades this atheist philosophy professor that there is a God, and so on. You might imagine that kind of scene, right? They're about to say, no, let me tell you the truth, and I'll preach something and convert you. Instead, here's what they say: "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter." Yeah, we don't care. If our God, notice they say if, verse 17, if our God, whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, then, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue. So, I mean, it's a fascinating moment here. And my advisor, when my PhD program, Carol Newsom, she has a great section of this on her commentary on Daniel. But she points out that what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do here is they really punt. I mean, they say, like, if our God can save, then our God will save. But if our God doesn't want to save, we still won't worship. What this does is this puts all the power back in God's hands. This is the book of Daniel is really all about sovereignty, God's sovereignty, even in a world that doesn't look like God is sovereign, especially in a world that doesn't appear to reinforce the idea that God is sovereign. To all appearances, Yahweh has no power. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, instead of trying to take that power or defend God's power, instead they say, the power is God's. We can't argue it into existence. We're just going to trust that God is with us. So we're never going to worship you, no matter what you say or do. Maybe God can, so it's giving the power, really. It's ceding the power, or letting the king know that the power always is in God's hands to save. God can choose yes, God can choose no. Either way, I serve God. So the choice isn't mine. Yeah, the service is. So all to say that they don't defend themselves. They don't try to argue, but instead they recognize that God is the truly sovereign one. Well, Nebuchadnezzar hates this. He thinks this is so bizarre, so he gets mad, and it says his face got distorted. It's supposed to be because, like, kings, imagine like Queen Elizabeth, the second, right? She's like this very somber face most of the time, or King Charles, the new King Charles, right? He has very somber face, and if a king got so mad, or a queen got so mad and upset that, like, they were like shaking with rage, it might look silly. In fact, you're supposed to be dignified as a king, right? And if you get really mad, so mad that you're like shaking and your face gets red, it's in part because you don't have enough power, right? So like if I'm supposed to have power over my kids, and then my kids never listen to what I'm saying, and they're messing with me, and I'm saying, stop it, stop it, stop it. I'm the dad, I'm supposed to have the authority, but if I'm yelling and screaming at them and my face is turning red, it means I probably don't actually have the authority in the room. It's kind of a sign that I'm not in power. And here, like in other places, we see that the king loses his like emotional cool. And that actually is a subtle sign to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that the king actually isn't in control, never was in control, never will be in control. There's another thing that happens in Daniel all over the place, which is knowledge, that the king says and claims to have ultimate knowledge, but then there's always these times where the king actually doesn't know, can't know something. And that knowledge is given as a gift to Daniel or his friends. So here we have like a sign that like there's a crack in the king's story about the world. The king actually isn't fully in control. So then he ordered the furnace heated up to 7 times more than was customary. I mean, he just gets this really, really hot furnace, and he ordered some of the strongest guards to bind these guys and throw them in the fire. The men were bound. They were still wearing their clothes. The thing was, clothes were expensive back then, especially if you were a high-ranking official. They should have taken the clothes and, like, sold them or something. But instead, they were in such a hurry, they just threw the guys with their expensive clothes into the fire. Then verse 22, because the king's command was so urgent and the furnace was so overheated, the raging flames killed the men who lifted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But the 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound into the furnace of blazing fire. So the guys who throw them in just get incinerated immediately. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they happened to fall in, so they didn't get burned up right away. And then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, again, showing that he doesn't know something surprising to him. He's not actually in control. And he said to his counselors, hey, wasn't it 3 guys we threw into the fire, bound up? And they answered the king, yeah, true, okay. And he replied, but I see 4 men unbound, like what happened to the ropes that I tied them up in, and they're walking around in the middle of the fire, and they don't seem hurt. And then the 4th has the appearance of a god. Who's this 4th one, right? Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire, and he said, hey, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then he calls them servants of the Most High God. Come out, come here. So he recognizes that whatever God they're worshiping is bigger than him, and it's bigger than his God. Who is this 4th shadowy person in the furnace? Of course, it doesn't say. We as Christians might look back and say, this is some sort of premonition of Jesus. One thing I might say is that I think God in the Old Testament is Jesus. That is to say, there's no kind of separation there. I might say this is an angel. I might say it's a kind of I don't know, a hologram, almost like, of God's appearance. But according, kind of in our historical purview here, Jesus has not yet become flesh, so it's not his body in some way. But nonetheless, God is present with them in some tangible way in the midst of the fire. So then the servants of the Most High God come on out. So they came out from the fire. They just walked out the door. And the satraps, prefects, governors, and the king's counselors gathered together, all these high-ranking guys who wanted them dead. They gather and they saw that the fire had no power over the bodies of these men. And that's really the ultimate question here. Who has power? What has power over the people who worship God? The hair of their heads was not singed. Their tunics were not harmed. Not even the smell of fire came from them. Nebuchadnezzar said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." So he blesses Yahweh, whose temple he just knocked down, who sent his angel. So he's interpreting it as an angel, and delivered his servants who trusted in him. They disobeyed the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own. So he gets it. The king's command means nothing to them because they worship a God who is stronger and more powerful, even though it doesn't seem like it. Therefore, he says, I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that utters blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb and their houses laid in ruins. Literally in Aramaic, their houses will be turned into public latrines. So laid in ruins is a nice way to put that. But he wants to turn their houses into outhouses, public outhouses. But there is no other God, he says, because there's no other God who's able to deliver in this way. Now, some Christians read this and they say, great, that's a great ending to the story. Nebuchadnezzar gets it. But there's a subtle hint here that something's not quite right. The chapter 4 has like another part of the story, and Nebuchadnezzar doesn't quite get it, it seems. He loves this God now. He thinks that the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is great. But notice what he does. He makes a decree, a royal decree, that anyone who utters blasphemy is going to get destroyed. Which you might say, awesome. That way no one will utter blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But the king is still taking it in his own power to enforce this with violence. Notice what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said when the question was put to them. Is your God going to save you? And they said, it's up to God. One might suspect here that at the end of the story, Nebuchadnezzar still has something to learn about his own humility and his own power vis-a-vis God. It's not his responsibility. It's not his responsibility to use his political power to force everyone, violently especially, to praise the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. God can probably take care of that on God's own time and in God's own power. Nonetheless, he promotes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego again. They're like double promotion, I guess. Now they're like really, really powerful. Now, where's Daniel in this whole story? We don't know. He does not even mention. But then he comes back in chapter 4. I'm going to skip over chapter 4 a little bit, but chapter 4 is, Nebuchadnezzar basically loses his humility a bit and says, like, I did all this. I built my kingdom. I built everything. And then God says, well, I'm gonna try to show you some more humility. Turns him into an animal for a season, and then eventually he comes back to becoming like a full human being. And in that time, he realizes some full humility, and he stops the whole thing where he's going to kill people who blaspheme the God of Israel. But he ends up asking for, in a way, kind of true forgiveness and talking about really just blessing and praising God. So the end of chapter 4 is Nebuchadnezzar's kind of full conversion, you might say. When the period is over, I, Nebuchadnezzar, so Nebuchadnezzar is speaking now in chapter 4, verse 34, I lifted my eyes to heaven, my reason returned to me. He became not an animal. He said, I blessed the Most High and praised and honored the one who lives forever. For God's sovereignty is an everlasting sovereignty. So Nebuchadnezzar isn't talking about how he has the power now. He's saying that God is the sovereign one, and God's sovereignty is everlasting, and it's God's kingdom who endures from generation to generation. So Nebuchadnezzar realizes that he's not the true power. All the inhabitants of the earth, even kings, are accounted for as nothing. And God does what God wills with the host of heaven, so all the heavenly beings and the inhabitants of earth. There is no one who can stay his hand or say, what are you doing? So this is like a complete reversal from what Nebuchadnezzar said in chapter 3. And then we have chapter 5, where his son Belshazzar. So Nebuchadnezzar apparently dies soon after that. And Belshazzar, his son, takes over. And Belshazzar was sort of co-regent for a while. The history of this is a little wonky. The last king of Babylon actually was a different guy, Nabonidus, but nonetheless, Belshazzar has a feast, and he starts to kind of, the kid kind of forgot his dad's lessons. He starts to kind of treat the God of Israel as kind of a plaything. He takes out all the wonderful implements from the temple that had been taken from the temple in Jerusalem, all the bowls and cups and things that were really nice, made out of nice materials, and he begins to serve them like in a feast, kind of a, just a common feast, and kind of bragging that he owns the God of Israel. And that's when the hand comes out and writes on the wall and basically says, your time's up. And Daniel's the only one who can interpret it. And at the end of the night, the Persians take over. So at the beginning of chapter 6, they're called here the Medes, but really this is talking about the Persian Empire. So chapter 6 of Daniel opens with the Persians in charge, or the Medes, they're calling them here. But Darius is a king. And it says in chapter 6, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps stationed throughout the whole kingdom. So the Persians take over Babylon and basically like run the empire, the old Babylonian empire. They just take it over, and they kind of keep a lot of the administrators because they're good administrators probably. So they just keep these people. It's like a corporate takeover, and they keep a lot of the people who used to work in the high, the C-suite positions. So that's Daniel and his friends. They're still there, still working, but just for a new king. And now there's 3 presidents. That's verse 2, including Daniel. So Daniel's job in the story, he's supposed to make sure that the satraps gave account so that the king might suffer no loss. Okay, so Daniel is the stop loss guy. Daniel is the accountant who audits everyone every year, and apparently he does a great job of it. Now, if you're a high-ranking administrator in the ancient world, you really were looking for the graft. You wanted to take the money. Like there's tons of evidence about it. Like these tablets we dig up from the past. I mean, you can see all this money was just leaking from the empire into the pockets of these high administrators. So Daniel, this fastidious guy who's going to oversee everything perfectly, is now the accountant. And now everyone is very sad. So they decide to kill him. We're going to kill the accountant so that we can do whatever we want with the funds, right? So Daniel soon distinguished himself above all the other presidents and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to appoint him over the whole kingdom. The anti-theft guy, the anti-graft guy is going to be in charge. So the presidents and satraps tried to find grounds for complaint against Daniel in connection with the kingdom. So they're going to try to set him up so that he can't audit them anymore. But they couldn't find any grounds for complaint of corruption because he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption could be found in him. So he's a kind of perfect worker. The men said, we're not going to find any ground for complaint with this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God, his Torah. That's where the weakness is, because the Torah is the weakness in some way. You can't eat the right food. You got to watch out for what you're worshiping. You can't say certain things in public. You can't agree. You can't make covenants with foreign gods or foreign kings. I mean, it really is a limiting and a weak thing to have all these rules. Other peoples from other cultures would have said, I'll do what the Babylonians want me to do. I'll eat what they want me to eat. I'll marry who they want me to marry. I'm fine. I'll work my way up. But Daniel is trying to preserve his religious identity in the midst of a culture that really wants to change it. And for him, he'll change some things. He'll give in some places, but he won't give, like his friends, he won't give in on matters of worship. But they know that this is where they're going to get him. This is his Achilles heel. So the presidents and satraps conspired and came to the king and said to him, O king, live forever. All the presidents of the kingdom, the prefects and satraps, the counselors and the governors, they all agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an interdict. So they're like, you should make a law, king, that whoever prays to anyone, divine or human, for 30 days except to you, O king, shall be thrown into a den of lions. Yet again, a punishment that didn't really exist in the ancient world that we know of. So it's a kind of over the top kind of punishment for these people. But why don't you pass a law that says no one can pray to anyone for 30 days? Just you, right? You're sort of a divine being, right? I mean, some people thought these ancient kings were godlike, like Pharaoh, sort of a god, demigod. So now, king, establish it. Sign the document so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. So the idea was that the Persians and the Medes, when they wrote things, they wrote down laws, they were unchangeable. Probably not really true, but it was a kind of a thing. It was I don't know, hyperbole about how much the Persians believed in written law. And therefore, King Darius signed the document. So now there's a law signed, in duplicate filed with the administrators. No one can pray to anyone for 30 days. And the administrators know this is going to get Daniel because he has to pray. So although Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he continued to go to his house, which had windows in its upper room that were open towards Jerusalem. So Jerusalem's a smoking heap of rubble, right? It's just maybe now starting to get, the Persians are the ones who begin to start the reconstruction process, but it took a long time. No one really lived there for quite some time. So it's still this pile of rubble, but nonetheless, Daniel's praying towards it. Why? Because that used to be the house of Yahweh, the temple. So he gets down on his knees 3 times a day to pray to his God and praise. So the offerings were offered 2 times a day, evening and morning, and then there was sometimes a noonday offering. So Daniel seems to be replacing the offerings of the temple with prayer. It's not just Daniel. Ezekiel does this. We see it happen all throughout Judaism that was in exile. The Jews who were taken to Babylon, they don't give up on sacrifices, even though they can't sacrifice anymore. Remember, in the first temple period, the time of David and Solomon and so on, they had to sacrifice to atone for their sins. And so once you don't have a temple anymore, how do you atone for your sins? You can't slaughter the animals, use the blood, clean off your sins off the altar, which is how they thought it worked. What are you going to do now? Well, what Ezekiel says, what we see with Daniel here is, and this is what later Judaism says, how is it possible today that Jews can have an atoned relationship with God without having an altar and blood and animals and sacrifices? Well, if you talk to any Jew, they'll say, our prayer. Prayer is an effective substitute for sacrifice. So the prayers, Ezekiel says this too, the prayers of the people substitute for the sacrifices in the temple. But that's why Jews, ancient times and modern, pray at certain times a day. This is kind of the origins of the synagogue, really, this meeting space where you can get together to pray and substitute for the sacrifices. And it atones for the people and it restores the relationship with God and with neighbor. So here we see this. 3 times a day, Daniel has to do these prayers. If he doesn't do them, his sins build up, right? He's got problems, and God's going to be mad at him, right? That's in his own understanding, his own theological understanding. So he's got to get this relationship straight with God. And notice that he could hide in the basement and not let no one see him, but everyone knows it's his custom, right? Everyone knows it's his custom to pray at this top floor. They're all looking for him every day. They could see him. So he's not going to change just because the king's changing. It's kind of maybe an act of like nonviolent resistance. And in fact, Gandhi from India, was a lawyer in South Africa for a while and protested against apartheid. As a Indian, there's a large Indian community in South Africa, and has been for a long time, part of the British Empire, moving people around. But there was a large Indian community, and Gandhi was there as a lawyer for a time. And Gandhi noticed the mistreatment of Black Africans. Indians were kind of an in-between apartheid status. They had kind of half rights. But Gandhi was really upset by all this. He said, why are people being treated differently because of their skin color, because of their heritage? So Gandhi got put in jail for public protest against apartheid laws. And when he was in jail, someone gave him a copy of the book of Daniel, and he read it. And he said, this changed his life. So he read chapter 6 of Daniel, and Gandhi said, I got it. I know what I'm going to do now. Nonviolent resistance. This is what Daniel did. He prayed, he knew he was going to get arrested, but he couldn't compromise on his faith. And so Gandhi's like, I'm going back to India. I'm nonviolent. I'm going to do this. Public nonviolent resistance and get arrested and cause a show. And of course, that ended up being exactly what Martin Luther King Jr., right? He learned these tricks of nonviolent resistance from Gandhi, and talks about the fact that Daniel, affected Gandhi and then affected him. So all to say that this kind of tradition of people reading this as the windows in the upper room were always open, and Daniel still goes up there to pray even after the law gets passed. Maybe he knew. Maybe this was on purpose. So the chapter 6, verse 11, the conspirators then came and they found Daniel praying just like they knew he would, because he was a good boy. He was going to do the right thing, right? They could trust him to be righteous. That's the problem. He's a righteous auditor, right? And they found him seeking mercy before his God. So he's not bothering anyone, and he's not throwing firebombs at the king, but nonetheless, he's just going to go about his business. So they approached the king and they said concerning this law, O king, did you not sign a law that anyone who prays to anyone, divine or human, within 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into a den of lions? And the king said, well, yeah, the thing stands fast. Yes, that's what I said. It can't be changed. So then they said, well, Daniel, one of those guys from Judah, doesn't pay any attention to your law. So if he doesn't pay attention to your law, other people are going to start not paying attention to your law, and then you got a big problem on your hands. So then, verse 14, the king heard the charge. He was very distressed. He wanted to save Daniel. He likes Daniel. He's not actually mad about this, but he's just worried now. And until the sun went down, he made every effort to rescue him. He's trying all these bureaucratic ways to try to get around the law, but at the end of the day, the parliamentarian said, "I'm sorry, but the law is the law." So the conspirators came and said, "No, O king, that is a law of the Medes and the Persians. You can't change this law." So then the king gave the command, and Daniel was brought down and thrown into the den of lions. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you faithfully serve, deliver you." So the king's got no hard feelings in this. But the king ultimately has to follow his own law. But he does know that Daniel's God is powerful. So a stone was brought and laid in the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his own ring. So he like a wax seal, right? So that no one could open it. It's not that it kept it, but it's just you could see if the seal was broken, right? So to make sure that no one changed this thing. And then the king went into his palace and spent the night fasting. So the king is not eating, right? He's in order to pray. He's trying to like supercharge his prayer life because he's praying on behalf of Daniel. So then at the break of day, the king got up and hurried to the den of lions. Now notice, like we're seeing this from the king's perspective. People have pointed out that the kings are the main characters in Daniel chapters 1 through 6. Like Daniel doesn't change, the king changes. And actually, like when push comes to shove, like the narrator is going to stay with the king over Daniel. So that is to say that the king's transformation, like it's kind of a claim of the book of Daniel. It's possible for us with our faith to transform the world. The people of Judah might have worried about why the exile happened. The book of Daniel seems to make the claim that at least one positive thing comes from the exile when Jews get spread around throughout the world. And that is that the message about Yahweh, the God of Israel, gets spread around the world. So let's see what happens. So in verse 20, when he came near the den where Daniel was, he cried out anxiously, "Oh, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you faithfully serve, been able to deliver you from the lions?" And then the voice of Daniel, you can kind of imagine, like from behind the rock, that Daniel's voice comes out, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they would not hurt me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no wrong." So he's like, I actually didn't, I prayed to my God, but that's not really a wrong thing, right? But I was found blameless. That is to say, God saved me. God's power, God's angel, the messenger, the same one we see in chapter 3, this messenger of God, the angel, God's power on earth is the one that saved me. So then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him because he had trusted in his God. The king gave a command, and those who had accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. This is what we call corporate punishment, right? So the idea, very common in the ancient world, was that when somebody did something wrong, like a whole group of people, their whole family had to be punished for it, or their whole people had to be punished for it in some way. This is the king's command, right? But notice it's not Daniel's command. Daniel's not asking for this, but nevertheless, the king seems to still trust in royal power, the power of violence to enforce faith. So we see here, even at the kind of pivot point of the book of Daniel, a bit of a I might say like a cynical view of human power. Political power will always ultimately believe in itself above God. So then King Darius wrote to all the peoples of the world, "May you have abundant prosperity. I've now made a decree. The kings are making laws again, that in all my royal dominion people should tremble and fear before the God of Daniel." I don't know about you, but making laws that everyone should love Jesus probably isn't going to make them love Jesus. So I see this as actually a subtle criticism of the Persian king. Nevertheless, the king ends up recognizing that the God of Daniel is a living God, enduring forever. That divine kingdom shall never be destroyed, and that dominion or that sovereignty shall have no end. God delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, for he has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. And so this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. That's the end of the stories of Daniel. Chapter 7, we shift to a completely different type of literature. The stories are done. At this point, we start to get visions. This is what we call apocalyptic literature, the first real apocalyptic literature that we see in the Bible, the earliest at least, like the book of Revelation. borrows a lot of this kind of imagery from Daniel chapters 7 through 12. So we'll wait to get to that another day. But for now, just notice that these stories of chapters 1 through 6 of Daniel are kind of a standalone story. Chapter 7 through 12, the second half of the book of Daniel, it assumes kind of a different context and a different way of God relating to foreign kings. In Daniel 1 through 6, God is giving kind of authority and power to these foreign kings, allowing them to have it, but also at certain points taking it back or restricting it. Ultimately, though, the story focuses on how God's people can share the news of their God, even when it doesn't seem like their God has any power or any authority at all, but also even in a time of distress, in a time of crisis. And that ultimately, when push comes to shove, God will reward those who privilege their faith and who privilege their faith in God over any idols. So those are some of the main points I would say from Daniel 3 and 6, these stories that end up really kind of leading to the development of a theology of martyrdom in Judaism and then later Christianity. That is that they don't die in Daniel chapters 3 and 6, but much later, early Christians and Jews who die for their faith will end up quoting these stories, and they'll end up saying, "God saved Daniel. God's not going to save me." A lot of people say this. They'll say, "I'm going to die, but I know that my God can save me, like the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." In any event, that's about kind of a part of the faith that we see develop out of these texts. Questions, comments, concerns? Just kind of rambled on for a while there. Sorry.
It was good. I heard one wow. So thank you, Brennan.
Yeah,
Anybody?
right. This spring, starting in January, I'm writing a commentary on Daniel for the interpretation series, which is they're kind of rebooting this wonderful series that I've always really appreciated. That has to do with it's really kind of for pastors and for lay Bible study leaders. So I'm kind of you all are giving me a great chance to work through some material for my commentary before I actually write it. So if you have any feedback though, let me know.
Brennan,
Yeah, Penn, how's it going?
how you doing?
Good, thanks.
Can you tell again how King Cyrus fits in here?
Yeah. So
And later with the return to Jerusalem.
excellent. Yeah. So the book of Daniel is known, it's kind of famous for having these odd historical hiccups. So Daniel chapter 1 seems to say that Jerusalem is destroyed in 605 BC, but actually it's destroyed in 587. It says that Darius was a king before Cyrus, which is the other way around. Cyrus came first and Darius came next. So there are these strange historical anomalies in the book of Daniel. People have tried to come up with different explanations for them, but ultimately, I think this book was written like a little bit after this period. So it wasn't trying to be a history so much as it was trying to help people to understand how to live and survive and thrive as a Jew with like following this somewhat restrictive law of their God in the midst of a foreign empire that wanted to kill them. So how do you do that? How do you survive and be faithful to Yahweh and also survive in the midst of this empire? I think that's the point of these stories, not necessarily its historical element, but nonetheless, it does overlap with some history so that all to say that Cyrus comes before Darius in history. We know this. There's tons of evidence of this. But in the book of Daniel and other parts of the Bible say that, by the way, they are very clear about that as well, including the books of Ezra and Nehemiah talk about that. Cyrus comes first, then Darius. In Daniel, they're flipped. I don't know if there's a reason for that, if there's some sort of symbolic significance. I don't understand. But what Cyrus does when Cyrus invades Babylon, really chapter 5 of Daniel, when Belshazzar is king on the last night that Babylon is a Babylonian city and it falls, it's true that overnight Babylon fell to the Persians, and it's true that it fell without any violence. The priests of the city got so sick with the Babylonian king that they invited Cyrus in and they opened the doors of the city to him surreptitiously at night. So in the morning when the king woke up, the Persian soldiers were everywhere, and the people of the city were pretty happy because they thought the Persians were going to be better. And then King Cyrus was the one who began to say, "All peoples of the earth rejoice because I'm your king." Anyone that the Babylonians sent into exile, I'm going to send you home because I want you home and I want you happy and I want you working because your taxes are going to come to me. So I want to make sure that you are supercharged to do great agricultural work back in your homeland. So he's offered to send people home. You can read about this in Ezra. Ezra chapter 1 has a letter from Cyrus, and we actually have copies of a more general letter that Cyrus sent that was read everywhere throughout the empire that said, if you are in exile that's been deported from somewhere else, King Cyrus is going to send you home if you want to, you're not against your will, but if you want to, and is going to give you money, like state money, to rebuild your destroyed cities that the Babylonians ridiculously destroyed. And Cyrus loves your little local gods and would love to help you rebuild your little local temples. And all we ask in return is that you love the Persian Empire, that you love Cyrus the king. So Cyrus comes up with this really great propaganda. But ultimately, there's kind of a dark side to it too. The Persian Empire, if you don't get with the system, they'll kill you, and they're even more brutal than the previous empires. But on the surface, it's a very nice and shiny, happy empire. But so Cyrus, you can read about that. You can read the particular version of that letter that Cyrus sent to all the kingdoms. He sent one just to the Jews to say, "Hey, Jerusalem, Yahweh's your God, and I think Yahweh's really great. Why don't you get some money and go back home and rebuild the temple?" And only a few Jews go back at first, in part because they had good lives and they had, Daniel stays in exile. Why does he stay there? Because he's got a job. He's like running the kingdom, right? So he's important and needed somewhere else. But there's an initial group that goes back and they start to rebuild the temple. About a century later, Ezra comes back and Nehemiah come back, and they really rebuild Jerusalem. So there's like 100 years where Jerusalem is not a great place to live. Nevertheless, there are some people who have started to go back home. So the return from exile starts with Cyrus, but it's a long-term process until Jerusalem's really rebuilt.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Where is Esther in all this?
Great question. Where's Esther in all this? So Esther is another book about the Persian Empire, features the Persian king, and features a Jew living in the court of that Persian king. So she is during the time of Artaxerxes, which is later. It's a little after even the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. So she's like much later. And she's a Jew, right, who lives in the Persian world, but she's hidden. Like her identity is somewhat hidden. And notice that there's some inter-ethnic tensions in the book of Esther between Mordecai and Esther, two Jews, and Haman, the Agagite. He's not a Persian, but he's a guy who comes from a people who have for a long time hated the Jews and wanted to extinguish them. So there's this inter-ethnic strife within the kingdom. And the name Esther means I will be hidden. It also sounds like Ishtar, the name of a Babylonian deity, meaning that Esther is kind of her identity, her ethnicity is actually hidden. But also you can read that to be a reference to God, because I will be hidden. Esther is the only book of the Bible to not mention God. God's not mentioned in Esther, except maybe subtly, help will come from another quarter. Is that God? Is that not God that's being referenced there? So maybe God works in hidden ways. But that's kind of Esther's message is similar in terms of a court story. It's a Jew in the court of a foreign king who's put in a dangerous situation and has to make a really tough choice about whether to be faithful to their God and try to save their people, and in so doing expose themselves to great danger. So it's a great read though. I love Esther. Great book.
Anyone else? Brennan, it's always fascinating. Thank you, sir.
I appreciate it. I'll see y'all soon. We're going to get into apocalyptic literature. The weirdest stuff in the Bible comes up next.
All right.
Yeah, it is.
See y'all. Peace.
Thanks. Have a good night.
Thank you.
You too.